Jesse, it's Dennis Gray. Welcome to the Australian Rock Show. How are you?
G'day, mate. Good to hear from you.
First off, congratulations on an amazing effort. 461 jam-packed pages in a book which I can only imagine you've lived and breathed for the past couple of years. Must be satisfying to finally have it out there.
Yeah, it's a huge relief. And then you kind of lost a bit too. So, what do you do with your life after you work on something for such a long time? Because it, becomes your driving obsession. And Bond certainly was, and it was something that I spent, over 12 hours a day on for over 3 years, and then, another year of actually just, bringing it to publication. So it has been a complete obsession of mine, and has certainly sort of eaten into, my personal life, my family time. Wasn't earning a lot of money while I was doing it. So, I made a lot of sacrifices to do it, but it was absolutely worth it.
The manuscript was originally over 700 pages, right?
Yeah, the original sort of first draft was over 700 pages. So, over 200,000 words, I think. So,
wow.
It was a massive book. And, the thing is, I guess, with writing this kind of book is that you have to kind of strike the right balance between research and story, and that's the challenge. So that was what happened, I guess, in the editing process. And but I'm happy with the final result.
At what point did you consider a book on Bond and the last couple of years of his life? Was it during or after you'd published The Youngs?
Oh, it was definitely after The Youngs. Look, I mean, like a lot of people, I had read Clinton Walker's book, Highway to Hell, which I enjoyed, and it was a good piece of work for its time. And then The Youngs came out, and look, it did pretty well for me. It was published in 20 countries and translated into almost a dozen languages, and for me as a writer, it was a success. So naturally, Random House was interested in doing another book with me, and I guess really from the responses that I was getting from the Youngs, I mean, a lot of people were just saying, "Oh, you're just a Bond fan, you don't like Brian," all that sort of shit. And I'd been thinking about it a bit, and I guess I am. I guess I am a Bond fan, and I thought of all the books that I'd read about Bond, really apart from Highway to Hell, they hadn't really satisfied me very much, and I felt like I didn't really know much about Bond. And I thought, well, it's been, nearly 25 years since Walker's book came out. I think the time's right for another book on Bond, and I'm going to make it a big one. And really, some of the more recent books on Bond hadn't really addressed, I guess, the two key questions that I'm interested in, which are, how did he die, and did his lyrics end up on Back in Black? In fact, those books kind of just avoided it completely. So I wanted to tackle those issues. And
you've really become somewhat of I'd call it an AC/DC detective, haven't you? That's what it is. That's what the role is, isn't it?
Kind of. It's like Bored to Death. The show. The writer who becomes a detective. Yeah, it kind of felt like that at various stages of writing the book. Certainly with the investigation into his death, because when I first proposed the book to Random House, the idea was essentially Bond in America. That was the focus. It was from 77 to 79. But as I sort of got into it, I realised, you can't avoid the issue of his death. But it's so bloody complicated. So dense and confusing, and it literally took a year and a half of work just to sort of produce part 4 and 5 of the book, which is the part of the book dealing with his death. So it was a massive investment of time and labour to be able to kind of tackle the death issue, and but I think it sort of caps off the book very well.
It does, and we'll get to the book shortly. But first, I do want to ask you a couple of questions about your background and how AC/DC, and in particular Bon Scott, entered your life. So you're 1973 vintage, and I read you grew up in Balmain. Were you into rock and roll as a kid? Are you seeing live music, checking out bands around Sydney's pubs?
Yeah, like a lot of kids in Balmain, I used to go to the Bridge, and I was underage, and see bands there. And Balmain had a great sort of live scene, but no, I was never really, into the rock scene at all, really. It wasn't until I had a divorce back in 2007 from my first wife, and it was an incredibly difficult time for me. And I wrote a book about it. And I had moved to Darlinghurst on the other side of Sydney, and there was one night where I was just feeling totally suicidal, and it was at my lowest point, and I put on some Powerade. It was on my laptop. It was Give Me a Bullet, the song, and it just kind of just lifted me up at the right time, and just had this incredible restorative power, and the next day I was kind of like, I want to go running to this. I want to go to the gym and listen to this. And I was listening to it in the car. And suddenly I sort of became this AC/DC nut. And really, when I wrote The Youngs, and I suggested that to Random, I wanted kind of to do it in appreciation of what AC/DC had done for me. It wasn't a book that I set out to kind of take anyone down or anything like that. It was, I want to celebrate these guys. These guys are bloody fantastic. But as you get into the story of AC/DC, there are so many layers to it. And, not all of it is flattering to them. But your job as a writer and a biographer is to kind of cover all the angles on the story, which you have to do. And I think a lot of people sort of saw The Youngs as sort of my attempt to kind of bring down AC/DC, which is total bullshit, total bullshit. And this book on Bon is the same. I mean, I'm writing it because I admire the guy, and I love his music. And but when you're writing a biography, you have a responsibility to tell the truth.
Well, you'd no doubt be aware that the reaction to The Last Highway has been mixed. Mostly favourable, but some negativity online. I'm guessing, as you mentioned, you would have been prepared for that, because when you write about someone like Bon Scott, a hero to so many, when you question people's long-held beliefs, you're bound to find resentment, aren't you?
Yeah, and look, there's a group of mother hens out there on social media who kind of feel like they have a mortgage on the memory of Bon Scott or the Bon Scott legacy, and I'm upsetting them really just for telling the truth. I mean, I find it completely bizarre that people who, claim to love Bon wouldn't want to know how he died. It's for me, that's just totally weird. So, to go to the steps of kind of deleting posts about the book or deleting other people's comments about the book, sort of pretending that it doesn't exist, ignoring it and hoping it'll go away. It's totally bizarre. So yeah, it's kind of been interesting the past week, sort of seeing how some people have reacted to it. But I've been getting hundreds of messages from people saying, I've been waiting, decades for a book like this to come along, and thank you for writing it. And, overwhelmingly the reaction from the press has been fantastic. But, there are some people who have an agenda or have personal connections and they want to protect their turf. and they want to bring you down. So yeah, I expected some sort of backlash to it, but I guess I'm surprised by some people who claim that they love Bond, but they don't actually want to know the full story. That's just totally bizarre.
Just going back a bit, has your opinion on the Youngs altered from when you wrote that first book to now? I mean, they remain as private as ever, even as recently as George Young's passing, with very little news released on his death.
Oh, look, I can separate my admiration for their music from my feelings about them on a personal level. I mean, I don't know them; I've never met them, but I know. For instance, I befriended Tony Carenti, who was the drummer on High Voltage. Great guy, absolutely great guy.
Just been doing some dates in Italy with Dave Evans.
Yeah, which came about all because he was in the book. He'd been ignored completely, and I know that he has made every effort to contact the Young family over the years, and has got nothing. And I think that's fairly ordinary. But when you're writing the story of AC/DC, you can't ignore some of the issues around the business of AC/DC, and that's not always flattering to the Youngs. But that's my job as a biographer.
Was this book a bigger challenge to write than the Youngs?
Oh, absolutely, 10 times the amount of work, because I didn't want to just rehash everything that had already been written about Bond. I wanted it to, really be an untold story. So if you're going to put untold on the cover of a book, I don't want any buyer of the book to feel ripped off. That was the challenge. I mean, how do you find new stories about Bond? How do I fill in this big blank map of America from 77 to 79? And that's what I set out to do. So,
well, there was never much written. There was never much written in detail about Bond's time in America previously, was there?
No, absolutely not. No, I felt it was kind of a real blank part of his biography, and so the challenge for me was, how am I going to fill this in? And I actually found it extremely difficult. And when I started, I thought, I've really taken on more than I can handle here. This is far too difficult. And I actually got quite desperate, really. And I had a map of America, and I started plotting the cities where they played, and would go through old copies of Billboard and find the FM stations in those cities, and I would contact their DJs at.
So that's detective work, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But it really shows the value of research, and you never know what you're going to find. So, I'd go through these old billboards and find the listings for the FM stations, and then I would go online, go on Facebook, find the DJ who worked at the station in 1977 or 78 or 79 or whatever it was. Contact them and say, hey, have you got any stories? Have you got anything you can tell me? Did AC/DC ever pass through your studio? And I was so lucky to get a response from a guy called Neil Mursky, who was a DJ down in Orlando, WDIZ. He went on to become one of the first producers at MTV and Howard Stern, and he was, very well known in the American radio industry. And he said, absolutely, I've got an audio recording of Bond that I've never played. You can have it,
Wow, that's gold.
And that was amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he said, I can introduce you to a guy from a punk band called Critical Mass, who was hanging out with AC/DC in Miami while they were rehearsing Highway to Hell. So I spoke to this guy, Michael Fazzolari, from Critical Mass, and he was fantastic, one of the funniest guys I've ever met in my life, who had all these stories about Miami. I mean, and Miami is a real blank part of that biography of Bond. We know that AC/DC was in Miami, but beyond a few lines in, the Murray Engelhardt book, there's not a lot about it, right? And he told me these fantastic stories about hanging out with AC/DC for 5 weeks. And Michael, in turn, introduced me to Bond's girlfriend in Miami. And they were extremely close. So it was a no-brainer. I caught a train from New York to Miami, and I went to stay with her.
It's brilliant. So you knock on one door and it opens others, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So, like, when you say no stone unturned, that's what it means. It means you go through everything, and you also go through, everything that's been written before to see if something's been missed. And that was a lesson that I learned from writing The Youngs, is that, you can never do enough research. And, that there are clues in things that have already been written. It's just that you have to, investigate it more deeply.
Now, the long-held belief is that Bond died from acute alcoholic poisoning, death by misadventure, which is on his death certificate. Yet in your book you allege that Bond, who'd already suffered heroin overdoses in 1975 and again in 1976, had done heroin on the last night of his life. So, although none of us were there, what you've discovered and concluded is highly possible, because in early 1980, Bond is spending lots of time with both Pete Way and Paul Chapman from UFO, both heroin users at that time. And I'm going to read a comment, if you don't mind, from Pete Way, lifted from an article written by UK rock writer Jeff Barton last year, titled "What Really Happened on the Night Bon Scott Died." So this is referencing a photograph of Pete and Bond backstage at the Hammy Odeon in February 1980. And he says, "Now, we as UFO were on substances, right? We were using heroin after the show. I've got to be very careful here. One of the guys that was bringing it to us was Australian, and he came down with Bond. And, if you do cocaine and drink, you get a violent reaction. But if you've never done heroin before, and we were doing heroin after the show like we always did, and you drink, the odds are that at some point you'll fall asleep and you'll choke and you'll die." And you've also mentioned Rania Habal, MD of the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine, places Way's comments into context. "Alcohol is a very common co-ingestant in heroin overdoses," he comments. "Additionally, a fatal heroin overdose is nearly always caused by respiratory arrest." Quite strong statements there from both Way and that doctor, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about that Barton article, which was actually originally published in 2005, and really that was sort of an article that kind of changed everything, really, because the conventional story, as a lot of people know, was that it was alcohol poisoning, that Bond went out with Alistair Kinnear, that he passed out in the car, Alistair went back inside his apartment, left Bond in the car, came out the next day, discovered his dead body. And then you have this Barton story where he's interviewing Paul Chapman and Pete Way, and it's a completely different story, which is that Paul Chapman finds out that Bond is dead on the morning of the 19th of February 1980. And the thing was that, Walker, who I mentioned before, did an updated version of his book in 2015, but he didn't even really address what Chapman and Way had said. But I really felt that, there could be some truth in both camps, in the conventional story about Alistair Kinnear and the Chapman Way story. So really what I was trying to do was kind of piece it all together and find the common threads in the two stories to piece together a narrative that kind of explained what happened. And, my conclusion after sort of doing all the investigation was that there was no doubt that Bond had snorted heroin back at the Music Machine. And, I found, two people who were there who believed that he took heroin. And so the police investigation must have been pretty bloody ordinary if, 37 years later I can find two people who, were there who thought that he did heroin.
What are the chances of Scotland Yard reopening an investigation on that?
Oh, probably very minimal.
Why didn't the coroner order a toxicology test?
Well, there was no toxicology report released that I know of at all. So we don't know if there was a toxicology report. I would find it very doubtful that there was, because it was all handled very quickly. So from the discovery of Bond's body on the evening of the 19th through to the conclusion of the inquest, it was all sort of wrapped up in 72 hours, right? So it was done very quickly. And normally toxicology reports, take days or even weeks. And I suspect that had a urine test been taken, they probably would have found, traces of morphine. And at the end of the book, I sort of come up with two theories about how Bond might have died and actually what happened in his last hours. And one of the theories is that Bond was actually deliberately sort of left in the car because Alistair wanted to ensure that whatever heroin Bond had taken was, undetectable, or certainly give himself the best chance that the heroin wasn't found in Bond's system. Because the thing with heroin is that, after you take it, it metabolizes fairly quickly and sort of redistributes into the bodily fluids. So, just to say, we took a blood test and there were no traces of drugs found in Bond's system, that doesn't really say a lot, because you're not testing all the different parts of the body that you could be. Hair, bile, liver, urine. So I don't think it was a very thorough examination, and there are sort of conflicting reports about, the state of Bond's liver, for instance. Silver was saying that, he died of major organ failure, but, there have been comments that, Bond's liver was perfectly fine. So it's all very confusing, and I think if it had been really thorough, it wouldn't have been wrapped up in 72 hours.
Here's another piece in your book I found fascinating. So on page 302 of your book, you write, "It was a collective dereliction of care to Bond. It's far preferable for an ambitious band and its equally ambitious manager to ride the legend of a lead singer who loved to drink Jack Daniels than it is to admit that he used smack." Now, the manager you're referencing there is former manager Peter Mensch. Has he ever given his account of that time period, or he has pretty much dissed the band after being sacked?
Look, I've made attempts to speak to Peter Mensch. He's completely ignored them. I tried contacting him also through his wife, and she tried on my behalf, but he didn't respond. David Krebs, who was his boss at Lever Krebs, told me that he thought Peter Mensch had sort of felt fucked over by AC/DC, and that's why he didn't want to talk about them.
Okay.
You'd have to ask Peter Mensch if you can get onto him.
Now, it's easy to say in hindsight, but Bond probably should have had a minder during this time period, agreed?
Well, there was talk that Joe Fury was Bond's minder, but, I spoke to Joe myself, and he said, I wasn't anyone's minder. Yeah, I guess that's a criticism that has been made of Lever Krebs, that, someone should have been working as Bond's assistant, and certainly that's what Joe Fury said. He said, at the stage AC/DC were in their career, you would expect someone to be taking care of Bond. Yeah, but that didn't happen. Yeah.
Let's focus a little on the Back in Black LP. And story goes that a couple of days after Bond's death, his London flat is cleared out, his TV, VCR, and most importantly, his notebooks are taken. I guess most fans consider that at least some of Bond's lyrics ended up on Back in Black, possibly also as song titles. Now, your book digs right into the whole Back in Black mystery in great detail, so I'm not going to spoil it for people who may not have read it yet. But what I did find fascinating, and I recall reading this at the time, were Vince Lovegrove's comments from 2006, which states that the Scott family share the wealth, including a small share of royalties from Back in Black. So does that simply imply that the band used Bond's lyrics and titles on Back in Black, they were found out and have to cop up half-yearly payments?
Well, that's a conclusion you could come to. There are a myriad of reasons why, that might be happening. Some people have said that it was, done in recognition of Bond's contributions to the band. But, it's a significant amount of money when you think about it. And my argument would be, historically, that's not very like the Young family. They're very tight with their money. Silver Smith Bon's great love, who died at the end of last year, told me that she urged Isa Scott to get a lawyer and not to sign anything after Bon's death. So who knows?
We could assume there that after Bond passed, then one of his parents or a relative, as you mentioned in the book, got a lawyer and struck a deal with Alberts over royalties.
Yeah, I think that's a very feasible hypothetical, yeah.
Jesse, let's shift right back to 2017. Apparently we're going to get a new AC/DC album with Axl Rose out front. What do you think is next for AC/DC? How long can it go on for?
I wish it would stop. Look, I mean, I think they're diminishing their legacy by continuing with Axl Rose. I think it's very sad. I think they were such a no bullshit band for such a long time, you know, and they had integrity, and I just feel like they're just throwing away, 40 years of, creating this amazing brand by
the
just
brand sells though, doesn't
diluting it with Axl Rose. It's just, I find it bizarre.
So what's left to write about AC/DC? Is there another book in the works for you?
Oh, absolutely not. No, I'm done with AC/DC.
Done.
No, I mean, I spent 5 years, in this sort of AC/DC land, and it's a funny old place. You meet some interesting characters, and I've made some fantastic friends too. But my love was Bond era AC/DC, and a lot of people have said, "Oh, why don't you do a Brian Johnson book?" But that's not for me. That's for someone else.
Your heart's not in it.
No, I've just got different interests, and I also don't want to be sort of pigeonholed as a AC/DC biographer for the rest of my life, because writing about AC/DC was not something that I ever really set out to do. It was kind of just an accident, really. I started my career, writing a book about the Socceroos, and then I wrote about my divorce, and I've got plenty of other interests, and so I would like to, do a travel book or a history or a novel, something completely different. Just want to get away from it all.
In your opinion, how do you think former members like Dave Evans and Mark Evans should be acknowledged for their contributions to the band?
Well, Dave Evans does plenty of his own publicity. I don't need to speak for him, but, I think it's very unfortunate that Mark Evans never made it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think that was pretty disgraceful, really. Mark made a big contribution, and the music of that period is the music that holds up, and he was a part of it. So I do think that Mark certainly is owed a whole lot more, and so is Tony Carenti. And people just say, "Oh, he was just a session musician," but mate, he was the drummer on the first album. And no one can take that away from him. And it's pretty poor, to read sort of criticism of Tony just sort of saying, "Oh, he's just a session musician." I mean, it's historic, mate. He was the drummer on the first record.
Which leads me to my next question. I think if you look at somewhere like Fremantle has the statue of Bond, there's a Bond Scott Crescent in Canberra's suburbs, AC/DC Lane in Melbourne. Do you think a city like Sydney could do more to honour the legacy and influence of AC/DC?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really surprised that we don't actually make more of it. Because, really, where are the sort of the AC/DC... Where's the AC/DC tourist trail in Sydney? It's there are all kinds of landmarks that people could visit.
Victoria Park, Checkers, sure.
Well, Burwood, and we don't make anything of it, and it's kind of bizarre because around the world AC/DC is massive, and there's thousands of AC/DC fans who want to come to Sydney, and I've received emails from them myself saying, "Oh, where should I go? What can I see?" And in Brazil and in South America, AC/DC is absolutely massive. Absolutely massive. And, if we had a some sort of AC/DC tourist map, I think we would be helping the tourist industry here, because AC/DC is massive around the world, and we underestimate how big they are.
Maybe that could be your next publication, mate. So, a couple of final questions, and I'll let you get out of here. So, is Bon Scott bigger in death than he was in life?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt. And I think what Bon continues to represent is, living life on your own terms, and that's a very powerful thing, no matter how old you are. I say it in the book that no matter how hard I tried, I could never sort of live my life like Bon Scott. Mm. And a lot of us, I think, sort of compare our own lives to Bon, and that's why we idolise him, is because he was living the kind of life that we don't. But, I'm glad I'm still alive, and I'm 44, and we forget that, he died at the age of 33. And it was tragic, but the point I make in the book is you can't blame anyone else, for Bon's death. He made his own decisions. He was an adult, and one of the things that really annoys me about some people in the Bon Scott sort of fan community is that they infantilise Bon. They make out as if, he wasn't capable of making his own choices, but he was. And ultimately, he took the risks. He made his own choices, and unfortunately, the last one he made just turned out to be a pretty bad choice. But he lived life on his own terms, and that's how we should remember him.
Jesse Fink, every guest on our show gets to choose a song by an Australian band, something which is significant to them. What would you like to choose, and why?
Oh, look, I'm a big fan of I'll Be Gone by Spectrum.
Let's play that. Jesse, thanks for chatting with us today, and good luck with the book and for the rest of the year.
Thanks a lot, mate. Cheers.